In Monster Hunter, we classify different types of monsters into various classes. These are applicable to both small and large monsters. Each type gives us an idea of what to expect, especially when it comes to large monsters, as it informs us on what we will most likely have to watch out for in battle. Just like classifications in the real world like mammals, amphibians, and reptiles, each subset of monsters has a wide variety of species which represent it. Fang beasts, for example, are what we would perceive as mammalian creatures, sporting a mix of primates, rodents, canines, and a couple of others. Initially, Fang beasts were classified as primatius, due to most of them closely resembling our real-world primates like Congalala and Rajang. Only with the release of Monster Hunter Portable 3rd, the term Fang beast made its first appearance, as by this point in time the classification was already composed of primates, rodents, and swine-like monsters. This shows us that at least in Monster Hunter, the different classifications are malleable, and more of a term created to categorize similar creatures instead of being a tool to clearly separate different families of creatures. Comparing this to the real-world classifications would fall somewhere in between phylum and class on the animal classification chart. Of course, there are monster types that are more focused, especially the likes of amphibians, carapaceans, and temnotherans. These hone in on very specific traits to classify their monsters, as they would not fit in a more broad classification without making the same classification useless in itself. There's one classification though that does this anyway, and thereby becomes useless when seen as a tool for recognizing monster appearance and general body structure, but I will address that monster type later in the video. First, looking at one of the most populated classifications in Monster Hunter, the flying wyverns. We can prove the point I made about monster types not really being a vehicle for a concise evaluation of a monster's characteristics. One good example of this would be comparing one of my 3rd gen favorites, Giginox, to something like Rathalos. The Wrath species would be the prime example of what a flying wyvern is supposed to be. A giant dragon-like creature walking on 2 legs with the front limbs perfectly developed for flight, and the animal using them for exactly that. The Wraths inhabit many kinds of environments, and most of those lend themselves to their capabilities. They can roam across large stretches of land quickly, unhindered by vegetation or geological hindrances like mountains, cliffs, or canyons. Flying is what they do best, and that is precisely the reason why they are classified as flying wyverns. Now let us take a look at Giginox. While it can fly, it doesn't rely on it nearly as much as other wyverns like Rathalos and Rathian. Also, it moves primarily on 4 limbs and is anatomically so far removed from other flying wyverns that it might seem puzzling as to why these are part of the same monster type. You might want to interject and argue that if it does in fact fly, the classification is more than justified, but hear me out. Jan Kutku can also fly and is in fact a wyvern, which by the argument standard would land it in the flying wyvern typing. Gurupeko can do so as well. But they clearly look more like birds than wyverns, so it makes sense. I hear you say, but what about Puki Puki? That monster looks more like a flying wyvern than something like Paolumu that clearly resembles a fanged beast with wings more than it does a flying wyvern. As I explained before, monsters with predominantly mammalian features are primarily classified as fanged beasts. Yet Paolumu is specifically a flying wyvern, even though it resembles a real-world bat more than a flying wyvern. And then there's of course the mostly non-flying flying wyverns. Nargacuga and Tigrex, for example, use their wings very sparsely. They'd rather get around in a quadrupedal stance and use their wings for occasional gliding from one point to the other. The irregularities are very akin to some real-life animals that also don't fit neatly into their respective classes. Most notable would of course be the platypus. Even though it is classed as a mammal, it does possess some characteristics that aren't usually associated with the rest of them. Sporting a duck-like bill, webbed feet, and even going as far as laying eggs instead of giving birth to live young, this makes the platypus a real outlier inside of its classification. Another egg-laying mammal would be the echidna. These animals are part of the order Monotremata, a sort of subset of mammals recognizable for having so-called cloacas, which in this case is the monotreme's name giver, derived from the word for single hole in Greek. So even in the real world there are examples of animals not fitting perfectly into their class, but why does this also happen in Monster Hunter? It's a made-up ecosystem. It could have been classified perfectly without any inconsistencies at all. Well, looking further into the matter shows us that the classifications aren't really that random as it might seem at first glance. If we take a look at the ecological tree diagrams, things start to make a little bit more sense. Here we can see that bird wyverns and flying wyverns aren't exactly separated due to looking more dragon or bird-like. Instead, the difference is in their feet. Bird wyverns are part of the suborder bird feet, which is then further sectioned into bird wyverns, true birds, and runner wyverns. But just as we thought we lifted the veil on this matter, another problem arises. Velocidrome, Geodrome, Great Jaggy, Kuluyaku, and others are classified as bird wyverns in-game, but are clearly not part of the bird wyvern infraorder. Rather, they belong to the runner wyverns, making their classification as bird wyverns flat out wrong. Although they possess bird feet, they are not bird wyverns, with some of them even being classified as dog wyverns instead. In the real world, there's one good example for something being at least named incorrectly. The jellyfish is one of the most well-known creatures in our oceans, yet there is a glaring problem with its name. Jellyfish aren't fish. They aren't even part of the same phylum as fish, which makes it super weird that they'd be called as such. In recent years, marine biologists have started calling these animals jellies to try and rectify past mistakes when it comes to coining the term jellyfish. Starfish aren't fish either, and there is a campaign to officially rename starfish to sea stars. This shows us one important thing. Monster classes and types in Monster Hunter are cemented by ecological research conducted by that world's biologists. While we can just say that Capcom messed up along the way and is now way too restricted when it comes to changing or amending monster types, the most fun explanation would be that the people of the Monster Hunter world are still learning and make mistakes just as we do in real life. Even though I spoke about some of the glaring inconsistencies when it comes to monster classification, it doesn't make the games bad. Monster types are only a small part of the Monster Hunter franchise and probably not worth looking into this deeply. While I personally would enjoy it if Capcom redid the whole classification and made them make more sense given all the new additions of monsters that don't quite fit their typing, I also prefer Capcom to focus on what really matters in the game, such as the combat, progression, and new cool ideas for monsters to keep the franchise fresh and strong in the future. I'm really excited to see what the future holds in store for us. With Monster Hunter Wilds on the horizon, my hype and love for the franchise is growing ever so slightly. Maybe we get to see new types of monsters that were not even remotely thought of yet. Imagine more insect-like monsters like centipedes or bombardier beetles. The insect kingdom has so many worthy contenders for being turned into a monster that it would take a whole nother video or two to talk about them all. Should underwater combat return to the game at any point, we could see more types of fish monsters like Gobel. Another candidate that doesn't really fit its classification as a leviathan. Wouldn't it be super cool to have actual underwater shark monsters roaming the seas ready to be hunted? Or hell, even giant squids for that matter. There's so much untapped potential on the table when it comes to monster types, and I hope Capcom sees the possibilities that still remain, instead of just creating new takes on flying and brood wyverns for the bulk of their new games. I think I mentioned everything that I wanted to talk about, so I'll leave it here. Please let me know in the comments if you think there are some monsters that don't really fit their type, and what types of monsters you'd like to see in the future. Leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. I hereby humbly thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.